Macron is continuing to push this, we call it strategic ambiguity in Europe around specifically troop deployments to Ukraine. He has started to get a little bit more assertive about not much, and I still think he needs to go further, about aid to Ukraine. He said 72 Caesar guns to Ukraine by the end of the year. Still, he could go further. As a percentage of GDP, France is behind Germany. France is behind much of Europe when it comes to contributing to Ukraine as a percentage of GDP. Italy is the only other country that I think is in its territory that is of significance here, of military significance. He, though, even if he's failing on that front more, has been pushing the idea that, you know, why couldn't we send troops to Ukraine? He's starting to float the idea that given certain circumstances, if some, you know, maybe a certain breaking point or a red line, or I guess more of a red mist, and I'll describe why it's a red mist here. It's because, well, you know what, I'll just say it now. It's because it's vague. He's not trying to, like, Kiev will be when we deploy troops. This will be to deploy troops. Is to cause hesitancy within the Russians who are judging French intentions. He is floating the idea of sending troops in order to cause that hesitancy in the Russians, in order to cause the Russians to guess what the Europeans will do if the Russians start to have success on the ground and move towards Kiev, or as the war drags on, what they might do in the future. It creates confusion about our intentions, which could have, according to some diplomats, like, well, that could have well, the Russians could panic, and and it could lead to an escalation crisis, which isn't impossible. That isn't impossible, but that doesn't mean that's the likely outcome. Anytime you have this type of diplomatic jostling over a war, there is, of course, the risk of escalation, which some people are concerned about. But others say that by creating this vagueness, by not allowing Putin to be the one drawing all the red lines, do this is a red line, do this is a red line, then we could try to leverage the military capacity of Europe to try to benefit Ukraine's defense, to make it so that the worst case scenario could be avoided, i.e. like a complete and total Russian takeover of Ukraine, which the French are indicating, I think at the very least, they would not allow. And it's almost as like so that's why I don't call it a red line. It's more of a red mist. There isn't like, hey, this is the exact area where Mountain Dew, red mist, is that an actual flavor? I don't know. But red mist, it should be, if not. So Macron has been floating this idea. He has been talking to the press about it. He did a few press conferences on it. It seems that his whole cabinet is pushing the idea as well, defending in front of the parliament, and he's getting more aggressive about what he wants to see this war end as. And he's saying that the return of all of Ukraine's territory, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, this is what victory means, and this is what Europe should strive for. Again, these words would probably have more credibility from a diplomatic standpoint if he was to back it up with military aid, which I guess could be more financially difficult, maybe hedging the bets on other allies to find the difference and trying to diplomatically posture instead to take that advantage. But either way, this is the path Macron is cutting, and some people are not happy about it. The Germans don't like it. Olaf Scholz doesn't like it. Olaf Scholz says there will be no NATO troop deployments to Ukraine. But when he said that on Twitter, the context added feature added context and said, well, actually, the French said this, and there could be NATO countries that individually send their troops. And so, I mean, pretty rough if you're trying to send that type of unified message. So it at least is clear that the Germans don't intend on sending any troops to Ukraine, which I didn't expect the Germans to send any troops to Ukraine, considering their history, how much they've already moved, but where Olaf Scholz is politically right now. But there's other countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, which even if they're not coming out saying like banzai or whatever, I think the Czech Republic as well, they are at least floating some vague openness to it as well. So it's not completely concentrated in France here, even though France is the tip of the spear. They're leading the way, and they're the country of the most military strength that is doing this. They're also a nuclear power, which gives their words a lot more weight, even if the Russians don't want the French to have those weight in their words. They have hundreds of nukes. I think like 200 nukes. I forget the exact amount. But if they have hundreds of nukes and they can launch those at St. Petersburg, they can launch it at Moscow, they launch it at those major cities, they have to consider it. They have to consider it, whether you like it or not. The same reason why Biden had to consider what the Russians would do if we started sending aid to Ukraine. whether you like it or not. Now, that doesn't mean he had to act a certain way after, but he had to consider it. Now the Russians have to consider the French. Now, that's Emmanuel Macron's general strategy. It's to increase, I think, the leverage of the Ukrainians as the French are backing them more diplomatically, but also to create uncertainty enough to make the Russians hesitate. Remember how we hesitated in sending Abrams and all that other equipment? And how maybe if it would have been sent, well, we don't know this for sure, but maybe if it was sent sooner, could have had a different impact. Well, maybe if it has no other effect, it could stop the Russians from escalating in other areas, because they know that there's an area that maybe the French would be willing to touch. Sorry. I'm talking, I guess, too positively about the French. My body's rejecting it. That there's a policy that they might be willing to take an escalation that they don't want to match. If the Russians are fighting the Ukrainians and having difficulty, adding the French to that equation are not going to help, even if the French troops, which is the most likely scenario, and this is a scenario that might even happen without such escalations, they could go out there and start training troops on the ground. They could, and this would be even further, guard the border with Belarus, freeing up more Ukrainian soldiers to go fight on the front, or cover the front with Moldova, which would, I think, it'd be interesting to see how they handle people who are trying to flee the country and dodge the draft and get overseas. If it would be French troops catching those people, I'm interested in those dynamics, but that's the idea. It would free up more troops to go to the front. They also might do air defense operations, which again would free more troops from across Ukraine to go to the front and therefore supplement Ukraine's manpower problem. So it's not just creating uncertainty, but you could see that they could, in some minor ways, escalate without doing full declaration of we're putting all of our troops on the front line and fighting you. That would stop the Russians from like, oh, there's French troops in Ukraine, we're just going to nuke France. Because if the Russians are like, oh, they're training troops in Ukraine, oh, they have advisors in Ukraine, okay, if my troops nuke them, or maybe just like bomb Ukraine a few more times like usual and make that a diplomatic posturing, they're more likely to lean towards that. And so the French are making those options open. Of course, this all comes with risk. There's a type of nuclear brinksmanship that is going on in this equation that we have to acknowledge. But that, to me, is how I see the French position. Not everyone is happy. I already said the Germans aren't happy. I talked about some other people that are maybe a little bit more open to the idea. We, the United States of America, are apparently also not very happy. Let's read a little bit from this article, this Bloomberg piece. Emmanuel Macron didn't need to release images of himself walloping a punching bag to tell the world he was up for a fight. 1 second. Can we look at this picture? I don't know if I showed it on screen. Macron punching bag. This is a real thing. This is a real picture. I don't know why. I think it's, you know, Putin releases pictures of him on horseback to show he's tough. I guess this is just Emmanuel Macron's version of it. You know, he just wanted to, he's a tough guy, so he's a boxer. I love boxing. You know what? If I could get him to do some boxing, I'm not against it, okay? I love boxing. I love it. Even before he broadcast raging bull poses all over Instagram. Hey, Jake Malata. The French president's hawkish new stance was evident when he contrived to very publicly refuse to rule out sending troops to Ukraine. With the UK no longer in the European Union and Germany's government riven with division, Macron has been fashioning himself into the continent's de facto figurehead on foreign policy. I mean, yes, but this is kind of, is this an opinion piece? No, it doesn't look like an opinion piece. Does it say opinion piece? I don't know how Bloomberg organizes it. Okay, no, whatever. Continuing. He's taken a lead on confronting Russian aggression and the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. But not all of his allies are convinced he's the best champion of their interests. His controversial comment about boots on the ground earned an instant and very public recrimination from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and angered U.S. officials who privately say such a move might even risk fomenting a clash with Moscow. I guess this is the fear of nuclear brinksmanship or a direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia. I will say, though, recently, and this is something that needs to be talked about, because it's not like we're talking about us escalating and getting our forces involved. The Russians are getting their forces involved in a NATO country right now. And we have reason to believe, at least from Polish intelligence, that it's probably purposeful. And I'm not just talking about them hiring people to blow up Polish railway stations in the diaspora, the Ukrainian diaspora that moved over. I'm not just talking about all the spying operations or the big tons of GPS hacking. I'm not talking about the line between Finland and Estonia that was clipped. I'm not talking about any of that. In Poland recently, there was a Russian missile. I think I have an article up here. I just realized this would be, I think, a good point to bring up. So oh, here it is. We have, I forgot this happened too, that they no-showed after this. A Russian missile for, I think, the second or like third time entered Polish airspace and then left Polish airspace and then hit Ukrainian targets. So what we're talking about here, if we were to bring up a live map here, let's bring up Deep State. What we're talking about is that a missile came over here, went to the border near Lviv, crossed the border into Poland, turned around, and then went and struck somewhere down in Western Ukraine, possibly military production or, you know, an apartment block like usual. That's terrifying. This isn't the first time that happened, but what's different now is that there seems to be some indication that this might be purposeful. And after the Russian ambassador was invited by the Polish to come explain themselves, they just didn't show up. They just ignored them. Poland is considering its options after the Russian ambassador refused to show up after being summoned by the Polish Foreign Affairs Ministry to discuss the violation of Polish airspace by a Russian missile on March 24th, Polish defense minister said, as reported by Polsat News. Ignoring the summons is a show of disrespect to which Poland cannot remain indifferent, he said. This is not the first time we have had to deal with violations of both law and international standards. He stressed that the Polish government will take additional steps to address the Russian diplomat's behavior. We are in constant contact with the Foreign Affairs Minister, the Prime Minister, the President, and the National Security Bureau. These decisions must be coordinated, as is the response of the entire Polish state. Russia's ambassador to Poland, Sergei Andreev, was summoned by Poland's foreign ministry because of repeated violations of Polish airspace by Russian missiles. A Russian missile entered Polish airspace. And by the way, this is the same, you know, if you don't like this guy and you're like, ugh, I can't believe you want to show up, that's very disrespectful. Can I just say, Russian ambassador, Poland, paint, if you wanted to feel slightly better. Here he is covered in paint. Oh, well, you can just see it here. Here he is covered in paint. Here he is covered in paint too here from Polish protesters and Ukrainian protesters. Let me read the rest of this though. A Russian missile entered Polish airspace near the village of Osodow in the Lublin. Whoa, I've been in Lublin. I know this area actually. Yeah, so Lublin is an area. I knew it was across the border. I just didn't know exactly where it was. I didn't know. Lublin is right here. This is Lublin. So it was in this area. It was in the northern part of their border with Ukraine. The object was tracked by the Polish military radar systems throughout its flight. The Polish Foreign Ministry demanded explanations from Russia and called on the country to stop terrorist air attacks against the residents and territory of Ukraine and to end the war and deal with the country's internal problems. Polish forces would have shot down the missile that violated Polish airspace in the morning if there had been certainty that it was headed towards a target deep within the country. Now this is something I do want to critique the Polish government for, because this is something that I think by them saying this, it indicates that Russian missiles could go in Polish airspace as long as they just don't hit Polish targets. If they don't hit Polish targets, then Russian missiles can enter Polish airspace and then come back and hit Ukrainian targets. And there's no reason for you to do that. You have the 100% the legal right to shoot those missiles down, and they're missiles. There's no people on the missiles. They're not people trying. You're not going to kill anybody. In fact, you would not only would you not be killing anybody, you'd be saving people. There's no point to shoot it down and expose Polish air defense positions if they know it won't hit. I don't buy that. That sounds like bullshit to me. Honestly, that sounds like bullshit to me. They can move around. We've got mobile artillery systems. I mean, mobile air defense systems. They can use mobile air defense systems. But air defense systems, they can move around. They couldn't just move that around if it could save lives, save the lives of some Ukrainians. Nah, I don't buy it. And by you saying this, the precedent could be set that the Russians think that they can just have those missiles go into Polish airspace, and as long as they don't hit Poland, they're fine. So they can use this as a way to try to avoid or maybe go around Ukrainian air defense. Not to mention, like, I just don't like the precedent that it sets. But they are indicating they'd shoot them down if they hit Polish targets, so that's something. But anyway, this is besides the point. This was all in service of the point. What was the original point? What was the original point? Does anybody remember the original point? Anyway, the point is that it crossed the border. This is an escalation that Russia had as its ability. This is an escalation that they're doing right now. They might have stumbled into it at first. It maybe the first few crossings were accidental, but even accidental crossings could still indicate to them that the Polish would allow it, and so they do it purposefully to test the resolve, and then they're like, oh, so we can just have our missiles go into Polish airspace. They are still looking for areas that they could possibly escalate. Not to nuclear war, not the full-blown war with NATO, but in a ways to try to check NATO and to violate the sovereignty of states like Poland. And so the French are saying that don't just allow them to draw the red lines. They want to draw the red lines. They want red lines drawn. They don't want every time Russia does this, Europe is left scrambling and they've got no response. That at least is Macron's position, or at least is my interpretation of it. His controversial comment about boots on the ground earned an instant public recrimination from Olaf Scholz, angered U.S. officials, and according to a senior official familiar with discussion among allies. There it is. Macron hints were issued to keep Russian President Vladimir Putin guessing, he said at the time, but officials familiar with NATO discussions on Ukraine said they may have had the opposite effect. By forcing Berlin to publicly rule out the possibility of sending troops, Macron managed to dispel what lingering ambiguity there had been about the whereabouts of allies' red lines, according to a senior U.S. official. Wait, by the way, forcing Berlin, they didn't have to force Berlin to publicly rule that out. They came out and did that. I don't know why they're saying this in the Bloomberg piece. Like, Berlin didn't have to come out and rule it out. They could have just stayed quiet. They had the ability to stay quiet and not rule out deploying troops if they wanted to keep the ambiguity. But maybe Olaf Scholz is too scared to because of possible brinkmanship that he didn't want to engage in. I don't know. But I don't know why we're saying this forces Berlin to publicly rule out. Macron managed to dispel what lingering ambiguity there had been about the whereabouts of allies' red lines, according to senior U.S. officials. I don't know. I don't know if I buy this, because I think for the Germans it got rid of that ambiguity. But how much that's Macron's fault and how much that's Olaf Scholz's fault? I mean, at the best, if I'm most generous, I would say maybe 50-50, like a combination. If I'm being generous to Olaf Scholz. But I think for the French commitment, the ambiguity or the thought that they might get involved has gone up. And for Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Poles, I think so as well, that ambiguity has gone up. And that suggestion has gone up, has gotten more attention, and something that's being talked about more. And that will only continue if the French actually end up sending things like advisors, or even though we know we have an idea to believe that there's some troops, even though they're not combat troops in the country, just like people go in to do training or go in to do air defense or go in to guard the border. Anyway, I don't know if I buy this. No, nor were the comments very smart from the standpoint of operational security, according to separate officials who also spoke to Bloomberg on the condition of anonymity, especially given that several countries already quietly have some personnel in Ukraine. Latvia, for one, had initially praised Macron's proposal. Prime Minister Ivica Selina, though, has since struck a different tone. We need to focus on Ukraine's needs, not on what Ukraine isn't asking for, she said at a press conference with Scholz on Wednesday. The discussion wasn't ready yet. Russian threat. The matter of Ukraine's military unity is all the more important now that Putin's emboldened by victory in the election he staged on the anniversary of his annexation of Crimea, while months-long doubts over the supply of Ukraine's weapons have yet to clear. There's also French domestic politics at play. Macron is throwing Ukraine to the forefront of the campaign for European parliamentary elections in June, depicting his far-right rival Marine Le Pen as a Putin ally. It's increasingly clear that Russia is a threat to us, French Foreign Minister Sébastien Lecornu told a news conference on Tuesday. We can't permit ourselves to envisage a Russian victory. There's little doubt some EU premiers are looking to Macron for leadership, with many welcoming his hardened stance on Russia, according to an official familiar with discussions at their most recent Brussels meeting. At the same time, France has backed Poland in demanding the EU think again on allowing Ukrainian grain to flow freely into the single market, something that's fueled farmer protest. Man. So I don't know, because I don't think the Russians were ever scared of German soldiers in Ukraine. I don't particularly think that was the case. The Germans could have kept their mouth shut. They didn't need to, start blabbing and saying, okay, you know what? No, we would never. No one would ever. They didn't need to do that. They could have just been quiet. I don't know what we're saying. We forced them to do that. They could have said, they could have even been more ambiguous about a rejection. Something like, the French have their foreign policy and we have ours. And that could have been it. And that's a way to be like, oh, for the Russians, it could be like, but also still leave them guessing slightly. Like, there's other ways they could have signaled, but no, they wanted it to be clear, unambiguous. I don't know why we put that blame completely at the feet of Macron here. I don't think that's fair. Isn't this good cop, bad cop thing going on there ambiguous in and of itself? Like Europe could go one way or another. I think it could also indicate that certain European states could go one way. Not that Europe as a whole could go one way. I could imagine Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and France sending air defense teams, but not the rest of Europe. And then the Russians are in the position of, okay, do we fight all of NATO? Do we start a fight with all of NATO over this? Or do we just fight the troops that are already here and maybe try to target those air defense troops? And I think they're going to choose the latter because it would be the smart move. But, trusting the Russians to make the smart move is never 100% bet, is it? Same with any world leader or any country. But especially the Russians as of late.